Well, hello and welcome to Making Waves to Move to Joy, which is a series of mini webinars where Johanna and Marie get real about the ebb and flow of finding lasting joy and happiness as women and as leaders. And so, as we go through this series, we'll be unpacking some of the top reasons that women leaders really struggle to find joy. And we'll do that by sharing our stories, exploring some of the lessons we have learned to recapture that joy, and sharing how you might be able to apply those lessons to reignite your joy. And so, as a reminder, this is being recorded. So, real quickly, as we are here to kind of add value to your life, if you joined because you do want to understand why you've lost your joy and you want to regain that spark, then we are excited to have you here. If that is not your purpose and that's not where you are in life right now, that is perfectly fine. We do encourage you to go and find a different medium that will actually bring you some joy. All right. So, we're going to get into our webinar today. We're going to talk about the myth of being perfect and the perfect time to start. And then we'll invite you for a coffee chat at the end of this to learn more about how Johanna and I help bring people to joy. So we have some returning attendees, but we also have quite a few people here who've never met us, Johanna. So would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a pleasure to meet everyone virtually. So I like to call myself the Chief Energy Officer that leaders and corporate professionals turn to when the life or the career that they've built starts draining more of their energy than it actually fuels. And they're ready to realign, reset or choose a next chapter that feels more like it's for them at this moment. I also support mid-career individuals, students, retirees and also women navigating menopause, right? So folks who want to move from burnout, obligation, or uncertainty into that clarity, that joy, and that meaningful momentum that you talked about, Marie. And Marie, about what about you?
Yeah, so I am the joy optimizer that mission-driven founders turn to when the business they created for freedom feels more like the grind they left behind. They still love their mission, but they're ready to pivot, expand, or perhaps even start over, and they aren't quite sure how to make that how to make that work with kind of that heaviness they feel right now in their business. And so, let's jump in. Over the course of season 1, we talked about some of the common things that are keeping us from joy and happiness. Today, we're going to look at another myth that keeps us from truly connecting, and that's the myth of the perfect time to start. And so, if we keep on waiting, will keep us from having all of that other joy. So, Johanna, looking back on your life, what's a time when you waited for the perfect time to start?
Marie, this is a really interesting question for me. And I say that because early in my career, I was in call centers, I was in recruiting, I was in the hospitality industry, and perfection was not the point, right? You learned by doing. You tested, you adapted, you refined. And I actually started way back even before all of that as a marine biology student, right? So the scientific approach reinforced that nothing starts finished, right? It was always about iteration. It was always about learning something new. But when I came into the corporate life, that shifted. And there was a moment in time that really stands out for me as to sort of where this myth started to really become part of my DNA. And I was working in a team that was, really thinking future focused. We were, big picture thinkers. We were setting, corporate strategy, and our role was to sort of, push the boundaries, to think about what was next. And I was working on a culture project, and I was told to schedule a play date, bring an early idea to the table. Don't bring something that's fully baked. And that made sense to me. All right. It matched how science works. Bring a hypothesis, not a conclusion. Bring something that's in progress, not perfect. And that's exactly what I did. I showed up prepared. I had data. I had early insight. I had questions that I had used to test the concept. And the intention was that we were going to play with this idea and make it better and build on it. So what I brought was not perfect, and it wasn't supposed to be perfect at that stage. But the play date went sideways. The idea was not explored. It was not built on. It was torn apart. I mean, it was torn apart brutally. And it wasn't tried, nobody tried to make it better. People were defensive. Conversations, really shut down. There was no collaboration. And it wasn't that they were tearing it down because it was a bad idea or it wouldn't work. It was actually because of ego, hierarchy, and playing in someone else's territory were all of the themes that were in the room. At that moment, I held it together in the room. I took the feedback, but I left crying. And then came all of these follow-ups, the text messages asking if I was okay, the hallway check-ins, the water cooler chatter, and all of that reinforced the same message. It's not okay. It's not safe to bring a half-baked idea here. So that changed how I showed up in the workplace. I stopped bringing those early ideas. I stopped experimenting out loud. And I started believing that it had to be perfect before I could even begin. But that wasn't who I was. And it's not who most of us are. Leaders, students, entrepreneurs, we're not that. We are the experimenters. But sometimes that is covered, right? That's actually, things happen that prove that it's not going to work. But what's interesting for me is that years later, the culture actually started to shift again. My team was then intentionally embracing progress over perfection, and play dates actually became moments where we played with ideas to make them better. So I did internalize that myth for a while, but the real growth from me came in unlearning it. And Marie, I'm interested in your experience. Where did this actually start for you?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? We do internalize so many of these myths, and we've talked about that throughout this series. And I grew up in the ocean. I loved the ocean. It was my favorite place to play. I could literally go out on the waves and fall asleep, and it would drive my mother insane because I would just go out there and lay, and I'd be drifting with the current, and she'd be panicking, right? But I loved that ocean, even though there weren't a lot of fish where, inshore waters where we were playing on the beach, but I'd always wanted to learn to scuba dive. And growing up, right, that seemed like the ultimate dream, right? To be able to go under the water with the fish, to actually become like a fish. And yet, when I was in my teens and 20s, I told myself, well, it's too expensive. And I put on weight. I told myself, well, I'm too fat. Like I can't wear all everybody who does it is super skinny, wearing the bikinis and the guys. I'm too fat to scuba dive. And it's still too expensive. And then of course I moved from South Florida to Pennsylvania, landlocked state. I, I'm not near the ocean. I mean, I could afford it now, but I'm still too fat and I'm not near the ocean. And then I got to the point where I'm like, well, now I'm just too old, right? Scuba diving's for young, right? It's for the kids. It's for the young guys. I'm way too old to scuba dive. And it was all those stories and excuses that I'm telling myself. And we tell ourselves those stories with everything where we're waiting for the perfect time to start. And so I had gone on a trip. I'm a marathon swimmer, so I'd been swimming every place I went. And really just, there were so many tropical fish and I was just loving it. Was talking to somebody and I said, "Oh, I just really enjoyed seeing all these different fish and being in the ocean. And I so wish I'd learned to scuba dive when I was younger." And they said, "So why haven't you?" And I rattled off my list of excuses. That's too expensive, I'm too fat, too old, I don't live near the ocean, yada, yada, yada. And they said, you just need to try it. Just try it. You're not too old. Try. And so I found a shop here locally. They actually work a lot with women divers. So it was fantastic from that perspective. I fell in love with scuba diving. I learned to dive in a quarry, which was horrible. But then I went in the ocean and it was fantastic. I have traveled all over the world now scuba diving. I now have actually become a dive master so I can help people explore that underwater world. And all I can say is I wish I hadn't let myself buy into my own excuses. I wish I had started earlier.
Yeah.
So
And thank you for that story, Marie. You're speaking to my marine biologist heart, right? I mean, very much. And what you said there about the stories that we tell ourselves is so true, right? After my experience, which was, one experience out of hundreds of experiences, I told myself the story that it's not safe. I had data to back that up because I had experienced it, but I didn't actually push that assumption. I didn't challenge that assumption. I didn't challenge that story I was telling myself, right? And you didn't early on until somebody else challenged that assumption in that story, right? When we challenge those stories that we tell ourselves, that's where we can unlearn this myth and release its hold on us. But I'm curious, as we think about that, that's one tactic to approach this myth. I'm really curious about where did this myth come from, right? And maybe why do we still see it persisting, even though we know it's a myth?
Yeah. And so as we start to dig into that, right, I do want to find out from those in attendance, if you could drop in the chat, what is something you've been putting off until it's perfect? Johanna talked about something at work, and I talked about something from personal. So we all have something in our lives where we've been waiting to start. And so, Johanna, you asked about like, where does this start? And no surprise to those that have been on these webinars before, it's fear by another name. It's called procrastination and rationalization. So we rationalize why it's not the right time. It is, you know, the economy's bad. When I look at starting my business, right? Because I've just recently launched a business. Here we are. The economy's bad. Nobody's buying stuff. I have no experience in starting a business, yada, yada, right? All of these things, they sound very rational. I needed a full-time income, got a family, all those things we tell ourselves. They're rational and they're procrastination. And yet, what we don't realize is that action cures fear, inaction creates doubt. And the longer we wait to start, the more doubt we accumulate. And so if you've always wanted to be an entrepreneur, you know, you just, you got to figure out how to start. You can, for me personally, I had to, I tried a multi-level marketing, wasn't my style, but loved the support. I needed to make sure I had the money to start. I needed to make sure I had the money to keep running my life because I really like living inside and eating food. Not to mention scuba diving, which takes money, right? Which we talked about. So instead of trying to wait to start while I was trying to figure out all those details to start, um, it actually just starting, just making the decision that, all right, I'm going to do this. And even though I hadn't launched my business, just to start to think about and write out, okay, I'm going to try and start by this date. That action really helps put that fear and procrastination back where it belongs. And so I often want to say that failure isn't fatal, although we often think it will be. So, what about you, Johanna?
Yeah, and I love that failure isn't fatal. Because for me, it's all about looking at failure as a moment of learning, right? And so starting allows us to learn, right? Starting allows us to grow. And I think sometimes the myth that we have to wait to be perfect is it starts really early in our life, right? Right? When we were in school, we were taught to aim for the right answer to get 100 on the test, right? We were not necessarily praised for the learning or the failure that we had along the way. Curiosity was replaced by being correct. And over time, even in the workplace, we were praised for accuracy versus inquiry. Um, that message continues to be amplified, right? Did you meet your goals? Did you hit your targets? Systems are built around risk reduction, not around experimentation. And you are rewarded for being thorough, for being polished, for being prepared, for hitting those outcomes. And you're penalized for being wrong. So, in my experience, perfection had become, a strategy for safety. And it wasn't until we in the organization I was at really named that one of the key, behaviors that we expected of all leaders was progress over perfection, creating the environment that allowed that to actually come forward, that experimented, that celebrated the failures because we could learn from them. Right. So I think the myth persists because we equate readiness with worthiness. We also confuse waiting with wisdom, right? If I wait, if I get more data, I'll have more wisdom, I'll be smarter, I'll have the right answer. And we forget that innovation has always started with a question, not an answer. And it's always started with just one step, like you said.
Yeah, so I love how you started there talking about the fact that it is judgment. And we start in school, right, with the judgment from others. And then we take that judgment onto ourselves.
Mm.
And we really, in order to break free, we've got to release from that judgment and just be willing to start small. And so when you think about, and I want to ask this to our attendees, when you think about that thing you've been putting off until you're perfect, that some of you did share in the chat for us, what is keeping you from starting it? And as you dig through those rationalizations that are immediately going to come to mind, what's the real underlying reason why you haven't started what you're waiting for? And so, Johanna, we've talked about where it comes from, why we have it. How do we get over this myth that there is a perfect time to start?
So for me, there's a couple things, and you've sort of touched on it, right? When you talked about a fear, right? Because often underlying all of those rationalizations is fear of something. So for me, I'll say two things, right? It's actually embrace fear, right? When we have fear, it usually is highlighting that something is meaningful and worthwhile, right? So fear is fuel and remembering that messy beginnings aren't failures. That's the birthplace of clarity, right? So embrace that fear that we have, use it as fuel, and remember that those messy beginnings are really how we start. You can refine as you go, but you can't refine what you never actually start. And the other thing is also really embracing an idea of a true play date, not the experience that I shared at first, but a real play date. A real play date isn't about being perfect. Kids don't show up to their play dates with a polished plan for what they're going to do or, an entire layout for the best Lego castle they're going to make. They show up with curiosity, with imagination, and with room to try new things. They experiment, they tinker, they build, they shift direction all the time. And that's the whole point, right? When we bring that kind of energy into our work, when we bring fun and play into the work, everything gets lighter. And one thing I always think about is, and I don't know if anybody's seen some of these videos, it's the Pike Place Fish Market in Seattle, where they literally are playing. They're selling fish, right? And they're throwing the fish, they're talking with the customers. There's energy, there's joy, there's playfulness. They turn ordinary tasks into connection and creativity. They started an idea, they started a movement because they brought play and fun into the workplace. So fun disarms fear, fun opens us up, and fun makes it feel less like a test and much more like an experiment. So for Marie, what's something that you think about in terms of overcoming the myth?
Yeah, it's always for me, start now, even if it's small. So it doesn't matter what your dream or your goal is, pick one step you can do now. And because any sort of action will create progress, and any sort of progress can help create belief. And it's interesting as you were talking about the children playing, right? And how we used to approach things when we were younger. Don't believe the rules you've heard and learned. You're not too old. You're not too fat. You don't live too far from an ocean. You don't, whatever your excuse is. If there is something you truly want, there is a way for you to get it. It's just a matter of discovering the path. And to that discovery, I would say embrace being a learner. I started my career as a special education teacher. I didn't expect my students to know how to do it or how to do it perfectly, despite the fact that for many of us, that's where that perfection, right, got reinforced. But we practiced and improved as we learned. And so experiment with whatever your new adventure is, whether that's a business or a hobby. And then, as you said, Johanna, bring back the fun. Explore like a small child. I was terrified of the marketing and sales components. And so I purposely chose to work with a company who helps with marketing. And their motto is, if it ain't fun, we ain't doing it. And now I actually truly enjoy those sales conversations, whether the person buys from me or not, whether it's the right time for them or not, whether I refer them to another coach because the other coach is a different fit. It just, there's so much fun in doing something that brings you joy. All those little steps into something that brings you joy are so important because the joy is in the journey.
Yeah, I love that, Marie. And actually I have a sign on my wall. You can't see it here. It says, find joy in the journey, right? Because the journey is where all of those experiences happen. The joy isn't when we get to the end of the journey. The joy is now, right? And I love a couple of other things that you just said too. If it ain't fun, we ain't doing it. I kind of love that, right? Because if it's not fun, why are we doing it, right? We have to find the joy in what we do. So that those two things really stuck out for me. And a couple of other things that I loved what you said was, just take that first step, right? Take that first step. Start now, even if you start small. Brilliant. So, what we want to do now with the last couple of minutes that we have is actually close out with three small practical steps to start. And I'm going to actually bring up the slides again so we can see what those look like. So as I'm doing that, Marie, do you want to start highlighting what our first one is?
Absolutely. So we talked about starting small, but accept the chaos. It will be messy, and that is fantastic, and that is fun. I'm a project manager by profession. That's what I did after being a special ed teacher. And honestly, I love things in order. I love my spreadsheets. But you know what? Chasing your joy, chasing what makes you happy, it's sometimes pretty messy. And so to start something new, it comes with uncertainty. That chaos is part of the creative process. So, Johanna, when you were talking about those kids, they're making up their own rules. How many times have you seen a group of kids playing and you go, well, what are the rules? Oh, we don't know, right? Or they're changing them as they go. So
Hmm.
stop resisting the mess and start expecting it. And when you expect it to be messy instead of expecting it to be perfect, you free up all that energy to move forward.
Yeah, and building on that, it's that learner mindset, right? It is all about taking the lesson from that chaotic moment, right? It's what did I learn as I was implementing? What did I take from this lesson? If there was a perceived failure, there was also definitely growth in that moment. So, progress over perfection in those small steps. Perfection always tells us that we have to have it all figured out before taking a step. Learning says, take the next step, learn from it, adapt, and go forward with the next step. Those tiny actions give you clarity, build confidence, and enable momentum. And as I said before, you can only improve on something that you've actually started.
Yeah, it's really hard to steer a parked car. So it's only once we're in motion that you can actually begin to figure out your correct path. And with that, we're going to talk about finding joy in the journey as our third step. Bring in the fun. You don't have to throw the fish like they do in the fish market, but fun dissolves fear. It opens creativity. And when you start to treat your journey towards joy like a play date where you experiment, explore, try new things. Pressure drops and possibility rises. And a little joy really goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, based on these three action steps, I'd be curious to see in the chat if there's anything that any of you are willing or interested in putting into practice or action this week.
Yeah, and you can share that in the chat with us. And then I do want to say, if you are searching for a way to see your joy journey and to understand how your emotions are showing up for you and maybe keeping you from being that imperfect start. So, both Johanna and I are certified in the Energy Leadership Index Assessment from IPAC. And what that does is it allows you to actually see on a chart how your energy is showing up. Where are you reacting in fear that you didn't even realize fear was underlying what was going on? And so once you can see that, then you can begin to understand how to shift that energy towards fun and playfulness and to tap into some of those other energy that is much more creative and create that learner mindset. And so Johanna works with corporate leaders and retirees, as she mentioned, menopause as well, in her program Clarity Current. And then I have a Joy Jumpstart program. Both of those include the energy leadership assessment as part of the um, coaching package there. For anyone who is attending this webinar, there will be a code, and we'll put that code both in the email and in the chat so that you can get 25% off of our packages now through the end of the year. So, Johanna, you want to help wrap us up?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're so thrilled for everyone who was able to join us this session today and throughout our series where we are busting those myths that sap our joy, right, or prevent us to find and continue to engage in that joy in our own journeys. And we're really excited because we also have defined our season 2 theme, which will start in January. And this is about embracing fearlessness. So our first session is going to be on January 26th, and we're going to be focusing really on the myth of what if I fail versus what if I can. So we'll be going deeper on a lot of these additional myths. You can look on our websites, either anchor2aspire.com or movetojoycoaching.com to find the registration links to sign up for the January 26th session or any of the others that you see here on this chart. Thank you for joining us on this journey back to joy. We're really thrilled that you're here with us to experience mini micro moments of joy in your day. Thank you so much, and we'll see you the next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.